"Show me your ID now." The shrill demand from Karen Blackwood tore through the calm afternoon like a siren in a library. Standing there, barely 5'2" and redder than an overripe tomato, she pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at my wife, Victoria, who had just stepped out of our black Tesla Model S with the effortless poise of someone who'd never known stress. Karen looked like she was about to explode, practically buzzing with a self-righteous fury, clutching a hefty binder full of HOA rules like it was holy scripture. Her voice rang out across the entire Maple Ridge neighborhood like she was delivering a sermon from a mountaintop. From my seat in the car, I watched as curious neighbors suddenly found urgent reasons to be outside watering plants, checking mail, pretending not to eavesdrop while clearly hanging on every word. Victoria, unbothered, remained by the open car door, her expression as serene as a still lake. That calm, faint smile she wore was the same one she reserved for tedious dinner parties and awkward small talk. A composed, practiced, unreadable. Her designer handbag hung casually from her shoulder, as if she had nowhere else to be but in the middle of this absurd confrontation. Watching it all unfold felt like witnessing a chihuahua barking at a lioness. Karen Blackwood, a self-declared matriarch of our affluent enclavia, had apparently decided that my wife was some sort of trespasser who needed to be confronted then and there. "You think you can just roll into this neighborhood without proper identification?" she screeched, her voice pitching higher with every syllable. "I don't care what you drive or how designer your outfit. I say nobody enters Maple Ridge without showing me their papers." She flailed that thick binder like a weapon, utterly unaware of how theatrical and ridiculous she looked or how many of the neighbors were now watching with open fascination. What struck me as strange, though, was how often she kept glancing toward the second-story window of her house like someone was watching, judging. Her hands, too, had a noticeable tremble, like this entire display wasn't really her idea. Victoria's reply came in a tone so cool and measured, it was almost airy. "I don't believe that'll be necessary," she said, her voice smooth as silk yet firm enough to make anyone with common sense pause and rethink their actions. But Karen was not anyone with common sense. "Not necessary?" she shrieked, her face turning a deep crimson. "Lady, I'm the chairwoman of this HOA. I have every right to confirm who belongs here. This is a gated community with strict protocols. Suspicious vehicles can't just pull up and park wherever they feel like it." The absurdity was hard to miss. Our Tesla was parked right in front of the house we now owned, the keys still in Victoria's hand. But Karen, clearly swept up in her own imagined authority, had stopped making sense. And something else was off. Her voice faltered when she spoke about security, and she kept fidgeting with her phone, stealing glances at it like she was expecting a call she couldn't afford to miss. I was just about to get out and intervene when Victoria reached into her bag, the expensive leather one she'd had forever. I assumed she was pulling out her license to bring this whole ridiculous exchange to a close. Instead, she drew out her wallet and opened it, not to present her ID, but to display something else entirely. A sleek black card shimmered between her fingers, embossed with a silver emblem I didn't recognize. But Karen did. The second her eyes landed on it, the color drained from her face so quickly it was like someone had flipped a switch. "No," she gasped, her voice trembling, the binder slipping from her hands and thudding against the sidewalk. "That can't be real. You a broken bar. You can't be broken bar." She trailed off, staring at the card as if it were radioactive. I leaned forward, trying to get a better view. Whatever this card was, it had just vaporized Karen's bravado in seconds. What truly fascinated me, though, was the way Victoria handled the moment. Not surprised, not rattled, almost like she'd been waiting for this. Her timing was too perfect. She had let Karen spiral before calmly revealing whatever that card represented. It was like a play, and Victoria was delivering the final act with style. And I began to wonder, was this really just a chance encounter with an overzealous HOA president, or had my wife planned this, down to the smallest detail? As Karen stumbled back, hands raised as though in retreat, more pieces began to fall into place. How Victoria had insisted on parking directly in front of Karen's home instead of our own driveway, saying she wanted to get a feel for the neighborhood. The mysterious phone calls she'd been making in the weeks before our move, calls that always ended abruptly when I walked in. And now, This ominous card that could make Maple Ridge's resident tyrant melt on the spot. Karen was still frozen in place when her phone rang, a sharp chirp that made her jump like she'd been shocked. With trembling fingers, she checked the screen. Her complexion paled even more. "Yeah, broken bar, I can't take that right now," she stammered, eyes darting between the phone and Victoria. "Yes, you can," Victoria said gently, her voice carrying a new edge of authority. "In fact, I think you should." The phone rang again as Karen stood paralyzed, caught between whatever force was calling her and the unsettling realization that she had just picked the wrong person to mess with. The neighbors were no longer pretending to be busy. They were watching openly now, some raising their phones to record the unfolding drama, easily the most riveting thing Maple Ridge had seen in years. Karen looked completely thrown off, as if she couldn't comprehend how she lost control of a situation she thought she had firmly in hand just moments earlier. Her authority, once so confidently displayed, had crumbled in the space of a few heartbeats, all thanks to my wife, whom she'd been treating like a trespasser mere minutes ago. From my seat in the car, watching this odd confrontation unfold, it became clear that this was more than just a petty dispute over HOA regulations. There was something deeper going on, something orchestrated. The black card, Karen's panicked reaction, the perfectly timed phone call, Victoria's unsettling composure, it all felt less like coincidence and more like strategy. My wife had known exactly what she was walking into when we moved into Maple Ridge, but if she'd anticipated this encounter with Karen, why hadn't she said anything to me? And more importantly, what exactly was that black card that could instantly dismantle someone like Karen, a woman infamous for her domineering attitude and unshakable temper? For the first time, I began to wonder if the quiet, graceful woman I married might be carrying secrets far bigger than I ever imagined, and that perhaps our seemingly idyllic move to this upscale neighborhood was about to unravel into something far more complicated than either of us had let on. The phone was still ringing. Karen hadn't moved, and Victoria still wore that calmly confident smile, the kind that told me, without a word, that she was always 10 steps ahead. That night, sleep was not an option. I lay awake beside Victoria in our new king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. She slept soundly, her face lit gently by moonlight filtering through the curtains, completely at peace, while I was anything but. I couldn't stop replaying the moment she revealed the card, couldn't forget the raw fear in Karen's eyes, or how Victoria had seemed to anticipate the call before it even came. It didn't add up. None of it did. And I've learned through years of working in systems analysis that when the pieces don't fit, it usually means you're missing a crucial part of the puzzle. So, instead of lying there restless until morning, I got up and did what any rational software engineer would do when faced with a mystery. I started investigating. I tiptoed out of the bedroom, grabbed my laptop from the barely unpacked home office, and launched what would become one of the most illuminating research sessions of my life. What I found in the county land records chilled me. Our pristine neighborhood, with its luxury homes and trimmed hedges, wasn't actually owned by the residents. Not really. Every single property, including the one we had just closed in, was built on land leased from a shadowy company called Sterling Holdings. I'd never heard of it before, but they apparently controlled a staggering amount of real estate across the entire tri-state region. The lease contracts were convoluted, filled with dense legalese designed to discourage scrutiny. But I've reviewed enough tech agreements in my career to know where to look, and what I found buried deep in the fine print explained everything. Sterling Holdings retained the right to revoke any property lease with just 30 days notice. No explanation required, which meant that everyone in Maple Ridge, us included, was technically just renting, and they could all be kicked out on a whim. Most of our neighbors likely had no idea, but someone did, and that someone had clearly been leveraging this knowledge to exert quiet control over the entire community. By 3 a.m., I was cross-referencing HOA documents with ownership transfers and lease addendums when I heard soft footsteps behind me on the hardwood floor. Couldn't sleep either? Victoria's voice was gentle, but there was a subtle shift in her tone, something weightier, more serious than before. She was wearing the silk robe I'd given her for our last anniversary, her hair cascading around her shoulders, and in the pale glow of the laptop screen, she looked both achingly familiar and completely unfamiliar at the same time. "I figured you'd start asking questions," she said, easing into the chair next to me with a grace that suddenly seemed trained. "The truth is, Marcus, I haven't been completely honest about why we moved here, or about who I was before we met." Her words hit like a punch, and not because I was shocked, but because a part of me had already begun to suspect. There had always been things about Victoria that didn't quite line up: her unflinching calm under pressure, her uncanny ability to get things done, even in impossible situations, the way she always seemed to have access to the right person at the right time. And now, it all made sense. "I wasn't just consulting for government contractors," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she searched my face for judgment. "I worked for the CIA, 15 years. And I was very good at it." She let the words hang between us, but it wore me down. "The lies, the double life, it erodes you over time. When I met you, I thought I could finally live like a normal person, have a real marriage, a real home." She reached out and gently closed my laptop, placing her other hand over mine. "But apparently, normal isn't an option for someone like me." She paused, and her eyes locked with mine. "6 months ago, my old team reached out. They'd identified a pattern of strange activity in several suburban neighborhoods: real estate schemes, money laundering, organized crime groups using HOA conflicts to mask their movements. Maple Ridge wasn't a random choice for us. I came here because something big is happening behind the scenes, and someone needs to stop it." Her confession landed like thunder, and I found myself re-evaluating everything, every reason she gave for choosing this house, every coincidence leading up to our move. But what struck me most wasn't the revelation itself. It was the look in her eyes. She was braced for me to be angry, to question her, maybe even to walk away. Instead, I felt something settle into place, like a final puzzle piece clicking in. "That real estate consulting job you told me about," I said slowly, the pieces rearranging in my mind. "That was just a cover, wasn't it?" Victoria nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. "All those trips a Broken Bar, those late-night calls a Broken Bar, those contacts, you always seemed to know a Broken Bar," I continued. "Yes," she said softly, and in that moment, I saw something I'd never seen before: a true vulnerability. Not fear, not regret, just the raw honesty of someone laying everything bare. There was something in her expression I hadn't seen before, a look of someone who had lived too long with secrets, for whom telling the truth felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff. "But what I don't get," I said, my thoughts still racing, "is why you didn't just tell me. If you knew this place was a threat, if you knew Karen and whoever she's working with were involved in something shady, why keep up the act? Why pretend to be surprised by her?" Victoria's lips curled into a real smiley, the first one I'd seen from her since we arrived in Maple Ridge. "Because I needed to know just how deep it went. I needed Karen to reveal herself, to act first, so I could document everything. And a Broken Bar because I hoped my husband might want to help me figure out who's really pulling the strings." She handed me her phone, scrolling through a collection of photographs. Each one captured the same black sedan, parked across the street from our home every single day since we moved in. The driver never changed, and his interest in us was anything but casual. "That car doesn't belong to a curious neighbor," she said. "It belongs to someone who's been keeping tabs on us. And after what happened with Karen today, I think we're about to find out who's really in charge around here." As I studied the images, I felt that familiar jolt of adrenaline, the kind I used to get when cracking a code no one else could solve, or tracing a buried logic flaw that held a whole system hostage. Victoria was right. I wanted in. I needed to understand what was happening here. But first, I had a secret of my own to confess. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. While Victoria showered, I made several phone calls I'd been avoiding for years. Old colleagues from my time in digital forensics and network security, contacts from the days when my job required security clearance and a steady hand under pressure. Because here's the truth about software engineers who used to work with the federal government: we don't really retire. We just go quiet, and we never forget how to find the signal buried in the noise. Victoria wasn't the only one in this marriage with a hidden past. If we were going to expose whatever criminal operation had taken root in our pristine little neighborhood, she was going to need someone who understood how modern corruption worked, how to follow money trails, track digital fingerprints, and connect the invisible dots. By the time she stepped out of the bathroom, towel-wrapped and focused like she was getting ready for combat. I had already arranged an emergency home meeting for that afternoon. I'd also begun compiling a detailed record of every shady financial transaction linked to Maple Ridge's community accounts going back 2 years. "You called in home meeting?" Victoria asked, glancing over the email I'd just sent to every homeowner. Her raised eyebrows said it all. The message was carefully worded, written to sound like a concerned new resident wanting to discuss falling property values and security risks, so harmless on the surface, but loaded with the weight of what we were about to reveal. She looked at me curiously. "Marcus, a broken bar. What exactly did you do before becoming a freelance developer?" I'd been dreading this conversation as long as she had been dreading hers, but now, saying it felt oddly freeing. "Remember how I told you I worked for a tech firm that did government contracts?" That was only partly true. The tech firm part, real, but those contracts were a little more a broken bar specialized. I paused. "I spent 8 years tracking financial crimes for the Treasury Department, everything from shell companies to digital laundering networks. Before that, I worked cyber defense for the federal government. My job was to keep foreign hackers out of places they had no business accessing." Her face shifted from surprise to something that looked like admiration. And in that moment, we both seemed to understand how absurd it was that we'd spent years hiding our real strengths from one another. The emergency home meeting was held in the community center at 4 p.m., and I have to admit, watching Karen Blackwood squirm in her seat, clearly panicked about what was coming, was almost worth every bit of deception that led us here. She sat at the head of the table like a nervous defendant awaiting a verdict. Her usual hoe binder replaced by a lonely manila folder she clutched like a lifeline. Around her sat the board members, well-meaning retirees and driven young professionals who had no clue that they'd been helping prop up a sophisticated criminal operation. Victoria and I positioned ourselves toward the back. I noticed how she subtly chose a spot with a clear line of sight to every exit, an instinct, no doubt, left over from a career where meetings could turn deadly without warning. I stood up and addressed the room. "Before we begin, I want to make it clear this meeting is being recorded. This footage will be shared with the appropriate law enforcement authorities if necessary." The reaction was immediate. Karen went pale. 2 board members leaned in to whisper frantically. One man actually stood to leave, but hesitated at the door before sitting back down, visibly shaken. "Over the past 24 hours, I continued, my wife and I have uncovered some startling information about the financial workings of this community. Information I believe every homeowner deserves to know." I launched my presentation, one that would have impressed even my old bosses in federal investigations. It included visual breakdowns of cash flows through fake LLCs, photographs of suspicious vehicles that had been tailing residents, and scanned lease agreements that most homeowners had never read but whose clauses could upend their lives. But what really turned heads was when I displayed the bank records. "These documents," I explained, clicking through spreadsheet after spreadsheet, "were obtained through perfectly legal channels. They show millions of dollars funneled through Maple Ridge's HOA accounts of funds that have nothing to do with landscaping contracts or pool maintenance." The room was silent, save for the rustling of papers and shifting of uneasy bodies. All eyes turned to Karen, who now looked as though the walls were closing in. "Someone has been exploiting our neighborhood association to funnel illicit funds from sources I doubt any of you would condone if you knew the truth behind them," I announced. Karen's composure broke as she trembled, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned ghostly white. When her phone buzzed, a soft gasp escaped her lips. I caught a fleeting glimpse of the screen as she nervously peeked at it. Just 3 words, that was all. But they were enough to shift everything into focus. "And this now," the message was signed simply, RB. The look on Karen's face, the raw fear as she read those initials, confirmed everything. This was the person in control, the puppet master behind the carefully manufactured comm of Maple Ridge. And now, the illusion was shattering. "I'm Jason Miller from Chicago, the voice behind Harper Stories. I'm always striving to improve here, so if you have feedback, don't hesitate to drop a comment. I truly appreciate it." The room had grown so tense it felt like the very air was vibrating. Karen's world was collapsing in front of us, brick by fragile brick, as she stared at that text like it was her own execution order. But before I could finish unveiling the details of the laundering operation, The door to the conference room swung open with a jarring bang, making everyone flinch. In strode a man whose very presence shifted the energy in the room. He was tall, likely in his 50s, wearing a tailored suit that spoke of obscene wealth, his silver hair styled with precision. But it was his eyes that grabbed me, piercing, calculating, the same kind of eyes I'd seen on some of the most dangerous individuals during my government work. "Apologies for the interruption," he said smoothly, his voice polished from years of dominance, "but I believe there's been a misunderstanding about today's meeting. Let's clarify things before anyone makes a decision they might later regret." Karen practically folded into her chair, looking like a reprimanded child. The terror in her eyes removed any doubt that this was R.B., the man behind it all. "Richard Blackwood," he said, offering a handshake with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Karen's husband. And you might say I play a behind-the-scenes role in how this community is managed." The way he emphasized behind the scenes sent a chill down my spine. Beside me, I felt Victoria shift slightly, her body tightening as her instincts kicked into gear. "I hear you've been doing a bit of investigating into our financials, Mr. Thompson," he continued, walking the room like he owned it, because in many ways, he probably did. "While I commend your initiative as a new homeowner, I'm afraid you may have drawn some premature conclusions." The HOA board watched with rapt attention, some of them confused, others too stunned to move. They knew this moment meant something, but not what. Men like Richard Blackwood thrive on intimidation. They're used to commanding rooms with money, polished language, and unspoken threats, but they often overlook the danger posed by those who've encountered far worse predators in far more volatile arenas. "Mr. Blackwood," I replied, opening the voice recorder app on my phone, "I'm fairly confident in my conclusions, and I suspect law enforcement would find them even more compelling." His confident facade faltered just for a second, but it was enough. He glanced sharply at Karen, his look a cocktail of fury and warning. "It told me everything. She wasn't a co-conspirator. She was a pawn, trapped in a game she couldn't escape." He recovered quickly. "You don't understand," he said, voice sharper now, dropping the charm. "Communities like Maple Ridge require a certain structure to maintain their value and safety. Everything you've seen, legitimate business practices designed to benefit our residents." I'd heard this song before. During my Treasury days, I'd seen crooks wrap criminal activity in the language of civic duty and economic development. I wasn't buying it. "What I understand," I countered, standing eye to eye with him, "is that this HOA has been a front for laundering money, that you've used fear to silence residents, manipulated your wife into being your enforcer, all while staying hidden behind a curtain of respectability." The room fell into a stunned silence. Richard's mask cracked. His carefully curated image was unraveling in front of the very people he'd fooled for years. Then Karen spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper, but somehow louder than any shout. "He made me do it," she said, eyes fixed downward, not daring to meet ours. "The yelling, the ID checks, the way we treated anyone who didn't fit his image of what this neighborhood should be. I never wanted to be that person. But he told me if I didn't maintain control, if I didn't stop people from asking about the finances." A broken bar. Her voice broke, but the implication was clear. Richard had held her hostage in plain sight, using her as both shield and weapon. As I looked around the room at the board, the neighbors, the woman at the center of it all, I realized this wasn't just a fight about money anymore. This was about reclaiming a community poisoned by fear. And Richard knew the game was up. Richard's grip on the situation was slipping, and fast. And what happened next wasn't spontaneous, it was something I'd carefully orchestrated. The moment I saw that ominous text message on Karen's phone, Richard Blackwood was about to learn a painful truth. Underestimating a former government cybersecurity expert was a critical and costly misstep. While Richard had been posturing in his overpriced suit and trying to bully the room into submission, I had quietly launched a digital surveillance operation sophisticated enough to make my old Treasury colleagues proud. The moment he stepped into the building, his phone automatically linked to the community center's Wi-Fi and network I had discreetly customized the night before with a very particular suite of surveillance tools. Not the kind you find on the open market. Every text, email, and call routed through his phone was now captured, analyzed, and stored by systems far beyond the average person's understanding, let alone access. And in the short window of time since his arrival, those systems had uncovered enough damning evidence to put him behind bars for the next 2 or 3 decades, assuming he made it to court alive. You know what fascinates me about today's brand of criminal? I asked, calmly pulling out my laptop and connecting it to the conference room's projector. I spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who held every ace in the deck. They think encrypted apps and disposable phones make them untouchable, but they forget that metadata, when read properly, is just as revealing as the messages themselves. The screen came alive, displaying a digital map of Richard's communications. Lines of connection spread like spiderwebs, linking his devices to a global network of contacts stretching from our quiet suburb to shadowy offshore banks in 3 different countries. For example, I continued, in the last 6 months alone, you've received over 200 wire transfers from shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, totaling around $12 million, all funneled through fictitious HOA expenses and non-existent construction projects. I watched as the color drained from Richard's face. His imperi painstakingly built Ondiciata was collapsing right in front of him, unraveled by someone who understood the digital battlefield far better than he ever had. But the real shock came when I opened another folder. This one held the contents of his text messages, messages with contacts who had no interest in community development, but every interest in criminal finance. These messages, I said, flipping through the files, are your conversations with affiliates of the Clav crime family. A wave of audible gasps rippled through the room. Karen clutched the table, looking like she might collapse from a mix of relief and disbelief. Based on timestamps and transactional data, I continued, you've been laundering their dirty money through Maple Ridge for nearly 2 years, masking it with fraudulent invoices and fake maintenance contracts, all charged to funds meant for basic community upkeep. Richard had walked right into a trap he never even saw coming. Every shred of evidence I needed was on his own device, every text, transaction, and call meticulously logged. From the back of the room, Victoria finally spoke, her voice calm, composed, and lethal. What my husband hasn't told you, Richard, she said, is that this entire conversation has been live-streamed to a secure FBI server. Agents are already on their way, with warrants for your arrest. Charges include money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and several violations of federal banking laws. Richard's expression morphed into pure panic, the kind of look you see in cartoons when a character realizes they've stepped off a cliff. Victoria moved toward the front of the room with the composed elegance of someone who'd done this many times before. My husband may have left government service, she added, but I never officially did. When the Bureau flagged this neighborhood for unusual financial activity, they asked me to look into it undercover. Of course. And what better cover than a housewife looking to settle into a quiet community? That revelation hit like a shockwave. The room fell completely still. Even I was momentarily caught off guard. Karen stared at Victoria in stunned awe. Just a day earlier, she had tried to intimidate her, unaware that Victoria was a federal agent gathering evidence against her husband the entire time. Richard, meanwhile, resembled a caged animal. His eyes darted to every door, no doubt calculating his odds of escape before the feds closed in. But there was one final twist he didn't know about. I'd already disabled the electronic locks on every exit the moment he entered the building, a small precaution to make sure no one could interrupt or escape before the curtain fell on this little performance. Outside, sirens grew louder, signaling the approach of federal agents. Richard's breathing quickened as reality sank in. "This isn't over," he growled, voice trembling with a cocktail of anger and fear. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. People will come looking for you when they learn what you've done." But Victoria gave him the same cryptic smile I'd seen the previous day when Karen had demanded her ID. In that moment, I fully grasped the depth of the game she'd been playing, a strategy leagues beyond anything Richard Blackwood could have ever anticipated. When the FBI showed up, it wasn't with subtlety. They descended on Maple Ridge like a precision strike team, methodical and swift. It would have been awe-inspiring if I wasn't sitting squarely in the middle of it, silently wondering if Victoria and I had just painted targets on our backs. After all, The kind of people whose money laundering pipeline we had just wrecked weren't exactly known for forgiveness. Agent Sarah Morrison, the lead on the case and Victoria's covert partner for over half a year, entered the room with quiet command. Years of dismantling criminal syndicates had given her a presence that didn't need volume to assert authority. Behind her trailed a task force, forensic accountants, cybercrime specialists, and heavily armed agents who fanned out with practiced ease, securing the area like they'd done this countless times before. As the sirens faded behind them, Richard seemed to shrink. His bravado melted away, his posture deflating as he came to terms with the reality that his threats and influence held no sway here. The full weight of the federal justice system was bearing down on him like an unstoppable freight train. But what happened next took every Enya, including Agent Morrison, by surprise. Instead of surrendering or invoking his right to legal counsel like most cornered white-collar criminals, Richard did something none of us saw coming. He whipped out his phone and began broadcasting live on social media. His voice trembled slightly, but his delivery was fueled by desperation and the raw energy of someone who knows they're seconds from ruin and willing to gamble it all on a last-minute Hail Mary. "What you're seeing right now," he declared, adopting the theatrical tone of a political demagogue, "is the federal government targeting innocent American citizens, people like me, just for trying to improve our neighborhoods and safeguard our home values from outside interference." I watched, stunned, as he spun himself from villain to victim in front of thousands. In real time, he crafted a compelling lie. Victoria and I weren't whistleblowers or agents, so we were government infiltrators, sent to sabotage a peaceful community under the guise of suburban normalcy. The live stream viewership skyrocketed, the comments flooded in, many echoing support from people who didn't understand the context but were quick to rally against what they perceived as government overreach. "These two," Richard continued, pointing squarely at us while keeping the camera fixed on his own face, "claim to be ordinary residents, but they've been surveilling you, recording your conversations, spying on your families, building cases against anyone who questions their authority." It was disturbingly effective. He weaponized public paranoia, reframing a criminal investigation into a story of freedom versus tyranny. Had I not known the truth about his offshore accounts and mob ties, I might have found his speech halfway convincing. But Victoria wasn't about to let him hijack the story. With a calmness honed through years of high-stakes operations, she crossed the room and whispered something to Agent Morrison, who simply nodded and stepped aside, granting her full control of the situation. "Richard," Victoria said sharply, her voice slicing through his monologue like a scalpel, "if you're going to tell a story, let's at least tell the whole one." She raised her phone, revealing a detailed display of banking records and transaction data documents that contradicted every word of Richard's broadcast. "For starters," she said, turning the screen toward the camera, "your viewers might be interested to know that you've been siphoning HOA dues to cover your gambling debts, and those so-called community upgrades, they exist only in your falsified invoices and fake work orders." The impact was immediate. Richard's smugness collapsed as Victoria began reading off exact amounts, dates, and vendor name as each piece of data a nail in the coffin. This wasn't just organized crime anymore. This was personal theft, embezzlement from the very people watching his live performance. The tone in the comment feed shifted rapidly. Supportive messages dried up, replaced by outrage and betrayal as people realized they were watching a con man unravel in real time. "And it doesn't stop there," Victoria continued, her voice now carrying the authoritative weight of someone used to dismantling criminals in public. "Those monthly security fees you've all been paying, pocketed. There's no security company. It's just another line item in his personal slush fund." Then came the final blow. Agent Morrison stepped forward with a tablet in hand, flipping it around to show a video of surveillance footage from inside Richard's private home office. The screen clearly showed him stacking bundles of cash while on the phone with individuals who had nothing to do with real estate. "Mr. Blackwood," Morrison said, her tone flat but firm, "you have the right to remain silent, and I highly recommend you use it because everything you say from this moment on is being recorded and will be used against you in a court of law." The live stream was still rolling, now broadcasting his arrest to thousands who had tuned in thinking they were witnessing government tyranny only to watch a white-collar criminal get caught red-handed. The unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed across the room as the truth settled over the audience online and off. Richard's phone hit the ground with a clatter, continuing to record nothing but his shoes as Agent Morrison calmly read him his Miranda rights and guided him toward the exit. Just then, Karen, who had remained silent through the entire spectacle, finally found her voice. "I need everyone to understand something," she said, her voice trembling, but steady with resolve. "I had no idea about the money laundering, or his ties to organized crime. I thought the worst he was doing was skimming a bit of HOA money to feed his online poker habit." Her confession was raw and painful, a glimpse into the mind of someone who'd been coerced, deceived, and trapped in silence by the very person she trusted most. "He told me that if I didn't keep control over the neighborhood, if I let anyone ask questions about the accounts or the construction plan, so we'd lose everything, that we'd end up out on the street. He said the government was just waiting for a reason to come after people like us, and the only way to stay safe was to keep everyone in the dark." As the FBI wrapped up their evidence collection and began transporting Richard to federal custody, I looked around the community center at the stunned, confused faces of our neighbors. They'd been living atop a criminal operation without realizing it, an operation that could have put their homes, their families, even their lives at risk. And Richard's global associates decided Maple Ridge was no longer worth the trouble. It was almost poetic in its irony. In trying to protect their community from imagined threats, these residents had unwittingly enabled the very danger they feared. 3 weeks after Richard Blackwood's highly publicized arrest and his federal indictment, which carried enough weight to likely keep him behind bars well into old age, Karen showed up at our front door. She was holding a casserole dish, and wore an expression equal parts relieved and remorseful. The change in her was striking. The tightly wounded woman who once demanded our ID with clenched fists had been replaced by someone lighter, like a person finally free of a burden too heavy to name. "I know this doesn't fix everything I put you through," she began, her voice still unsteady, but no longer laced with the panicked command of someone living under constant threat. "But I wanted to thank you for saving me from something I didn't even fully understand until that FBI presentation on money laundering and organized crime." Victoria, who had been quietly working behind the scenes with federal prosecutors to ensure Karen's immunity in exchange for her cooperation, invited her in for coffee. It was the first of many heartfelt conversations that slowly began stitching together the social fabric our community had lost during the years of fear and manipulation. The legal fallout from Richard's takedown came swiftly. With airtight evidence and several willing witnesses, the federal government moved efficiently. Agent Morrison explained that his arrest was one piece of a much larger puzzle, a coordinated strike against a global money laundering web that funneled illicit profits from drug rings, weapons trafficking, and human exploitation into seemingly legitimate real estate ventures across the U.S. Next to those crimes, his HOA embezzlement looked almost petty. The trail of evidence I had helped uncover revealed ties to the Kozlov crime syndicate, resulting in arrests across 6 states and 3 countries. A deeply embedded network that had gone undetected for nearly 10 years was finally being torn apart, its operations hidden not in the shadows, but right in the heart of suburban America. Victoria's work on the case didn't go unnoticed. She received commendations from both the FBI and the Treasury Department, along with a formal invitation to return to active duty. She declined. Instead, she opted for a consulting role, still impactful, but without the constant travel and secrecy that had once complicated our life together. But perhaps the most rewarding outcome wasn't found in federal reports or courtroom victories. It was in the way our neighborhood began to evolve. The fear and tension that once hung in the air like smoke slowly cleared. The promises made in those glossy real estate brochures of a welcoming, peaceful community finally started to feel real. The HOA underwent a complete overhaul, bringing in new leadership that included Karen as treasurer. With her first-hand knowledge of how financial corruption could take root, she became one of its most vigilant defenders, determined never to let history repeat itself. Monthly HOA meetings, once dominated by control and intimidation, turned into honest, productive gatherings. Residents were finally discussing real projects, so ones they actually wanted rather than shelling out for invisible upgrades and fake contractors. The inflated property value artificially boosted by Richard's money laundering scheme eventually settled back to reflect the real appeal of the neighborhood, not the financial needs of international criminals looking to launder illicit cash through real estate. Unexpectedly, Victoria and I found ourselves becoming the go-to people for community security advocacy, and not just in Maple Ridge, but in neighboring towns that had heard about our story through the widespread news coverage following Richard's conviction. Our unique mix of cybersecurity know-how and federal investigative experience turned out to be exactly what other HOAs and property managers needed to guard their communities against the sophisticated financial crimes now targeting the American housing market. That's how Community Security Solutions was born, our consulting firm focused on helping neighborhoods detect and defend against the kind of corruption that nearly brought ours down. The work was more rewarding than either of us had anticipated. It challenged us intellectually and gave us purpose in knowing we were directly helping families protect their homes from people who saw peaceful suburbs as prime real estate for hiding dirty money. Karen's transformation became a local story in itself. Once known as a harsh enforcer of petty HOA rules, she emerged as a symbol of resilience and redemption. With Victoria's help, she began therapy and slowly reclaimed the parts of herself that Richard had tried to erase: her independence, her sense of self-worth, and even her curiosity for things outside his control. She later used her own experience to help others identify the red flags of manipulation and abuse, becoming an advocate for victims who might not even realize they're trapped. Her past role as a neighborhood enforcer had always been about maintaining Richard's illusion of legitimacy, but the woman she became afterward, she used her position to truly serve and protect the community with compassion instead of control. 6 months after everything unraveled, I found myself on the back deck with Victoria, watching the sun dip below the horizon over a neighborhood that had finally become the quiet, welcoming haven we'd imagined when we first considered moving here. "You know," Victoria said, her fingers lacing through mine as the sounds of children laughing drifted through the air, "I think we finally found what we were searching for when we left the city." And she was absolutely right. What we'd discovered wasn't just a house or zip code, it was a community. One where people looked out for each other, where secrets didn't fester into corruption, and where justice, no matter how delayed, was always possible. It had taken a federal sting operation and the arrest of a high-level money launderer to get here. But sometimes, the best endings don't come easy. Sometimes, they're the ones you have to fight for. Have you ever felt powerless against someone who abuses their position? Maybe it's an overreaching HOA president, a domineering boss, or that one neighbor who acts like they run the entire street. Well, Marcus and Victoria's story is proof. Even the most intimidating bullies have something to hide. And sometimes, the quiet couple next door, they're exactly the ones who'll bring the truth to light. Watching Karen's fear turn to clarity, and Richard's arrogance collapse into handcuffs, was a reminder that justice might take time, but when it lands hard. If this story struck a chord with you, if you believe that ordinary people can stand up to corruption and win it, then you've found the right place. Ya Stories is where we shine a light on tales of everyday heroes and relentless underdogs. So go ahead, like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. We've got more true stories coming your way every week. You won't want to miss what's next. Another mystery unraveled, another victory you didn't have to pay a cent to hear.